Hi, we continue in Genesis 28 today as Jacob awakes from his sleep after the dream of God appearing on a ladder, no, at a gate, probably not, but more likely on a descent road from the sky down to the earth where he sits. And as we do, I'm going to go over just briefly some of the elements I went over at the beginning of this section, and also some that I went over in more detail in the introductory video to this whole unit of Genesis 28:11 to 31:55. And I really encourage you to watch that introductory video if you haven't. I'll just go over briefly a few things to get oriented for this section. So we've been seeing the entire Jacob story is shaped into these three basic units: Jacob and Esau at the beginning, Jacob and Esau at the end, and Jacob and Laban here as we're at. But as we've been noting, although we have a chiasm that goes from 28:10 to 31:18, and a couple more chiasms that link us with the end of chapter 38, there are many elements in this story that link us with further rounds in the story. For example, this scene at Bethel is certainly parallel to the wrestling scene at the Jabbok, and we'll see language that connects there, as well as to the Bethel scene in chapter 35 at the very end of this Jacob cycle. So it cycles around, as we can see, in these kinds of chiasms because the story itself involves a going out and coming back, not just going out to the old country and coming back, a symbolism of exile, and also of Abraham's journey as well, Abram before he became Abraham, but also of Jacob's journey with Esau away and back, and also of his relationship with the family in between the foreign land and the current land. So many levels of that, and that's what we've been looking at as we notice that there's at least three different levels at which we can read this story. The immediate plot of a character escaping from his brother at the behest of his parents, the two nations in your womb story, which is also within the story of Genesis. We heard that in the oracle to Rebekah back in chapter 25, and Jacob will become Israel on the return from quote-unquote exile in Mesopotamia, just as we saw that Esau is Edom, and we'll hear that repeated verbatim several times in the end of the chapters in 35 and 36. But most importantly, for now at least, is the post-exilic interpretation from the time of the Persian agreement to restore Jerusalem after they defeated the Babylonians and let, under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, the exiles return and rebuild the temple. And we'll see how that context of Genesis plays out against the pre-exilic so-called reform of Josiah, where he destroyed everything in Bethel in the goal of establishing Jerusalem as the central and only place of worship. So as I noted in the last video, the image of the ramp or the city ascent up to a city, perhaps up to Jerusalem, although archaeologically we can't see that. I showed the archaeological available one to the town of Lasich in Judah last video, and you can see that there or online. That perhaps that's more what's at issue. Is Yahweh in a temple in Jerusalem where you have to go through official channels and only certain people are allowed in at certain times? Or is God, as Genesis claims, the God of creation who is present with everybody, anywhere, anytime? And so that's what's at issue in the people of Yahweh's whole understanding of where they encounter Yahweh and what that relationship is. So that all is taking place in the post-exilic period. I also note some of the key words that we've been looking at. In the very first verse, we heard the Hebrew makom 3 times for place. And that isn't just a generic word. It's, as I noted last time, it refers, as it does in Deuteronomy, Ezra, and Nehemiah, to Jerusalem as the place where people offer sacrifice, as the place where Yahweh will put his name, as in Deuteronomistic language. And we also will see now that place will recur right here. And that's key, because as we see Jacob respond, he could have responded to all kinds of things, the promises, the very fact that there's a God, but it's all about the place repeated here, and what he does is about the place in establishing a pillar and pouring oil on it and renaming the city. It's only an after effect that he makes this vow, which many would think is the most important thing, but for the authors, plainly most of the attention is given to the issue of the place and what Bethel has to do with it. And I'll note now in advance, and we'll see it as we get to verse 19, that this is the first in a whole series of Jacob's place namings in Genesis. And I won't go over those all now, but you can see that the last two involve Bethel again. He calls the place El Bethel, which is to say God's house of God. It's like ATM machine, sort of, or a machine ATM is more precise. And we see it again here. So that's part of the whole framework. And plainly, the authors of Genesis are trying to emphasize that Bethel is a place where God can be encountered, very much unlike Josiah and the Jerusalem-oriented people. So let's put our keywords up, and we'll look at our scene here. So Jacob woke from his sleep. It's the first word in the sentence for emphasis, and as I noted last time, I won't bring it up now, this is one of several scenes in this unit about sleep and night and dreaming. So the word for sleep, Shana, here is only one other time in the entire Torah for Jacob's lack of sleep that he complains to Laban that his time 20 years as a shepherd out in the hills meant that he had no sleep. And so we can take it metaphorically as he doesn't sleep again until he gets out of Dodge, out of Mesopotamia. And he said, plainly speaking to himself here, because there's nobody there. So this is for our benefit, or maybe he just needs to speak it out loud. The word for surely here, aken, is a strong word. It's only here in Genesis, although it's 18 times in the Hebrew Scripture. The Brown Driver Briggs Lexicon notes it's stronger than ak, which is a small interrogative ejaculation like that. So this is a very strong word. Surely Yahweh is in this place. And if we go back up, we can note something about that in the theophany, in the words here, Yahweh said, I am Yahweh. And recall how different that is to what Abraham experienced, where we as readers were told, Yahweh said to Abram, go, but did not identify God's self by name. So here Jacob knows, I am Yahweh, the Elohim of Abraham your father and the Elohim of Isaac. But he refers to him as Yahweh. So surely Yahweh is in this place. Bamakom here, again recalling what we saw earlier. And I noted last time the Ezra, Nehemiah, and Deuteronomy parallels. And I didn't know it. And that raises several questions. Why should he have known it? Did his father Isaac give him a religious education? Did he tell him something about places? Why should he have any idea about whether Yahweh was any place at all? It has to do with who he understands Yahweh to be. Is Yahweh the creator and therefore likely to be experienced in creation and all around? Or is Yahweh just a tribal god of this particular family? And that's part of what he's discovering. And part of what the authors are discovering, the exilic situation, which is where Yahweh goes from being a god of a people who leads them out of captivity in Egypt and situations like that, to being the God of all creation, as we see in Genesis, and we also see in the later parts of Isaiah and Ezekiel as well, all exilic and post-exilic texts. So here Jacob uses Anoki matching Yahweh's Anoki here in verse 15. As Cohen noted here about Yahweh's Anoki, it referred to his immanence as opposed to his transcendence, a God who is with you, like the God whose footsteps you can hear in the garden in Genesis 2 and 3. Here, though, he notes, expressed as a person, expressed as a person, quote, acutely aware of their creation in the divine image, with a mission to accomplish in the divine scheme of things, yet tragically unaware of what that mission might be and to what extent he has played his or any part in its accomplishment. And he offers many examples. And that's plainly the case. Jacob's only on the road here to find a wife and to get away from Esau. He has no sense of he's being on a mission from God to do anything, and he still doesn't know what it might be. But he's aware now that there's something sacred going on between him and the God of his father and of his grandfather. And so Sparrow notes here, there is talk about a land that Jacob is now leaving, seed that as of now is not even a possibility, all families of the earth whose identity and number Jacob could not even imagine, and protection from dangers whose nature is hidden in the dark shape of the unknown. That in relation to the promises we heard in verses 13 to 15. So no surprise that we hear that Jacob is afraid. And why wouldn't he be afraid to have this kind of unbelievable experience, unprepared for it in any way whatsoever, and no one to talk about it and nothing particular to do about it except what he's going to end up doing? And in a translation note that I actually find helpful, you hear me criticize a lot of these NORSV translations as missing the point, or sometimes as being sexist or racist even in places. But this one's lovely, to say how awesome is this place. That really expresses the combination of awe and fear here. That there's a sense of awe in this place. And again, as we'll see, that goes completely against what we know from the Josiah story. This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And as Obloth, who's the one who thought of the place as a gate here, and we'll look at his note in another second, he notes that the identical phrase is only at Nehemiah 2:2, which we can see here, where the king says to Nehemiah the governor, then I was very much afraid, and having to do with the question of restoring the city, the place of my ancestors' graves. So certainly an echo there. In the whole course of the exilic and post-exilic reconstruction of the people of Yahweh. But house of God here is literally is Bethel, but in the pejorative, in the colloquial sense, but in the immediate sense, it's Bayit Elohim, the full name of that, rather than just El, the short version of it. It's only here in verse 22, down here, in the entire Pentateuch, but 76 times in the Hebrew Scripture, mostly late in texts like Chronicles, and then in Ezra and Nehemiah. So this is plainly suggesting that Genesis is part of the post-exilic conversation here. It's one of a number of words we see in this section and the Jacob story that are late words, highlighting that late sense of composition. And then the gate of heaven, or the gate of the sky, if you will, Sha'ar HaShamayim, and only in Psalm 78:23 elsewhere in the Hebrew Scripture. As my note below has, the gate of heaven for Yahweh is not in an urban setting like the Ishtar gate of Babylon that I showed in the last video. Here you can see a quick image of it again, but in the wilderness. And as Obleth notes below, that Sha'ar doesn't mean door, but a city gate. In other words, it's not a door into a room, but a city gate, as he notes, an enclosed chamber with an entrance and an exit. And as the picture I showed last time of the city gate in Lasset shows, it's a major space. It's not a gate the way we think of it, like a gate into a yard, but a whole area with commerce and often legal procedures and other things. Thus, not a ladder or a ramp at all. He notes that the word is used over 300 times in the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew language text, and never as a, quote, metaphorical reference to a temple. And so, having declared those things to nobody at all, he acts. And notice how this is the flip side of what he experienced. What he experienced was the angels ascending and descending, an action, and then God speaks, and in response, Jacob speaks, and then he acts. And this is deeply connected with chapter 35, and we'll look at that once we get to verse 19. So Jacob rose early, much like the messengers of God rose early to go to Sodom in chapter 19, and much like Abraham and Sarah rose early after leaving Abimelech, and like Abraham and Isaac rose early on the Akedah journey there. And we see another example from Isaac, and we'll see it one more time in the Jacob story. So rising early is usually meaning on the edge of a momentous situation. So early in the morning, and he took the stone, and notice the details we noted, the specification of the stone that he had put under his head, and he set it up as a mitzvah here, a pillar, the first one of several. Here's an image of a set of upright pillars. The term also later means a gravestone, the way we think of a tombstone, because that's also an upright stone, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be a memorial of other things as well as to a god. But in the Josiah sense, it's linked with idolatrous worship in Bethel. And so this passage is plainly coming after. It's hard to imagine that 2 Kings could have the story of Josiah's destruction of Bethel if the Genesis story was already part of the tradition. And he anointed it, he poured oil on it, he messiahed it, so to speak, although it doesn't use that exact language. He poured oil on it. And as Westerman notes, presupposes the already existing rite of the anointing of the Masavah as the conveyance of power to the holy object, which isn't surprising because this is for an exilic audience that knows all about those things. But normally those things are done in an urban context of the temple or in an established liturgy, not out here in the wilderness, and certainly not in Bethel, which he will call it now. As Michael notes, and I highlighted his work last time, and all the parallels between this story and the Babel story, I won't put that back up here, but he notes the first time a character renames a particular location in the Hebrew Bible. And he goes on to add, Jacob sought a name not for himself, but for God, by immortalizing the name of the deity Elohim over a particular place. Seen in this way, the change of the name of the sacred site by Jacob is in direct contrast to the quest for a name by the tower builders. Again, part of his comparison with the Babel story. So he called, or literally, he called the name of the place, and we see the exact same thing in chapter 35, which I'll show that chart in just a moment, Bethel. House of God here. And so let's look at Bethel, and we'll note, perhaps to our surprise, we've already heard the place called Bethel way back in chapter 12. With no controversy, Abram traveled east of Bethel and with Bethel on the west, and he journeyed in stages as far as Bethel and between Bethel and Ai, but they're just locations there. There's nothing special about them, and they're not described as sacred. But at least we should already know there's a name there. And as Westerman notes, interestingly, not resorting to source criticism, which is what many people might do here to suggest this is from a different source that doesn't know chapter 12. But he notes that the previous mentioned quote does not worry the transmitter, as a place can quite well be called by the later name, which is to say it's called Bethel here for the first time, but projected back into the Abrams generation, assuming the audience knows it by Bethel and not by Luz, and therefore it can be referred to that way. But the important point is Jacob is naming it that. Maybe he simply doesn't know it already had that name, but for him, it's the house of God. And then we see it here, and we'll see it again here, and then here's most of chapter 35 that's relevant, certainly all the places that mention Bethel. So he gets the word from God to go back to Bethel and settle there and make an altar, and he says to his household that's what he should do in obedience, go back to Bethel and make an altar in response to that in the very next verses. A couple of verses later he gets there, and he names it again, and then a few verses later he names it again. And it also involves taking the stone, as we saw elsewhere. So it really makes its whole framework when the entire Esau story is finished as well, to really close out the entire Jacob story. So Bethel is central to the story of Jacob here. And so what was it that was so horrible? We have to look at 2 Kings here, and I won't read the whole business of 2 Kings, excuse the typo here. I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with it, to read the entire story. But the context is that Assyria had defeated Israel in the north some 100 years before Josiah in the 620s, and the remnant of Israel who had not been taken into captivity lived in small towns and villages in the land, and some of those lived not far from Jerusalem, as you can see from the map here, in the area of Bethel. This all would have been Israel at that time. And so in that context, Josiah was attempting to bring everybody into Jerusalem under his control in the face of the impending Babylonian invasion, to try to have unity. And so to do that, we see throughout 2 Kings 23 a systematic attempt to define Bethel as a place of idolatry. Even though if one reads closely, we can see that what's being condemned isn't just worship of other gods, but worship of Yahweh in other places. In that sense, it's not that different than the Catholic Church's historical antipathy to Protestantism, especially in the early centuries when violence was at use both by Protestant churches and Catholic Church, when they worshiped the same God and they believed in the same creed, the Nicene and its development creed, but disagreed about liturgical authority over worship and which house that could take place in. So an internal dispute about power, not about who God is, but about where and how that God should be worshipped. And Josiah engages in murderous actions, and the text suggests he does it personally, although that's certainly unlikely. But we hear that he pulled down the altar, he burned the high place, like it was a one-man campaign, rather than what's much more realistic is that he had troops and other people to do that for him. It's as if we sent David in to destroy the Philistines all by himself. So the story in 2 Kings celebrates that, because the Deuteromistic history is all about Jerusalem and the centrality of Jerusalem. And throughout that, kings of Israel in the north are condemned for the so-called sin of Jeroboam, mentioned 14 times, which is to say, having worship at Bethel, and also at Dan in the north, but to say not at Jerusalem. And so all of Israel's kings are condemned simply for not having people centralized in Jerusalem. And Genesis is making a large protest against that. So we called it Bethel, and the name of the city. And so suddenly now we have a city. It's been place, and now it's city. And what seemed like the wilderness that he was out there in the middle of nowhere, as any artistic image shows, is somehow in the edge of a city. But there's no evidence of any city here at all. It's called Luz there, meaning almond tree, and we'll see its connections with all the business about the bark and the birth of colored and spotted and speckled animals in chapter 31 further, as we'll see. So then, now Jacob responds to Yahweh with this vow, and that's where we need to look at the key words to highlight what he says similarly and what he says differently. So the vow is only one other time, and that's a vow between himself and Laban there, recalling this event. So if, that's the big thing, if Elohim will be with me, and I note that's exactly what God says he will do, and will keep me in this way, which we see, I will keep you wherever you go, and adds this, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear. How Jacob thinks that God will give him bread and clothing isn't clear. This is not going to be manna, plainly. But presumably he's arguing that if he has bread and clothing, it must come from God. correlation is not causation, but many religious errors throughout the ages have been made by equating correlation with causation. And Jacob seems to be going down that road, but we'll see what happens when he reaches the end of his journey and what his conclusion is. So that I come again to my father's house in peace, in shalom. And as Westermann notes, Jacob represents at the same time the later Israel, which is the object of the fulfillment of the vow, which is to say, coming back to their place after exile. They would make Yahweh be their God again, as opposed to the gods of Babylon, and as opposed to having given up on Yahweh for not protecting them from the exile, an argument that Jeremiah and Ezekiel strenuously argue against to say it wasn't Yahweh's fault, it was your fault that you ended up in exile. Yahweh wanted you to be faithful, but you weren't. But for those who might have thought that it was Yahweh's failure to protect them, if they can come back to Jerusalem in peace, they'll make Yahweh their God. But this is not about coming back to Jerusalem. This is coming back to his father's house, not to God's house in particular, but back to Beersheba, where he left, in shalom, or in wholeness here. Then Yahweh shall be my God, which is to highlight that along the journey he has no God. He is going out godless, so to speak, to see what happens. And he finishes here with this. And this stone, the same stone which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house. And as my note below has, it's an odd image of a single unhewn stone as a house that parodies the numerous hewn stones required to build a temple. For example, Solomon's temple here in 1 Kings 5:17, the costly stones that are laid out in order to build the temple. But also here in 1 Kings 12:28, here about Bethel and Dan, and this is where Jeroboam sets those up. This is not quite in the same point, but I want to show that there so we can see that as well, as terms of God's house in Bethel and Dan, although it doesn't involve stones there. So if all that happens, he will build this pillar, which will become God's house. And notice that not only will God be present and experienced in Bethel, but a house there that is considered a sacred place. And suddenly it shifts to the second person. He's been speaking in the third person about God, but now he speaks directly for the first time. That you give me, I will surely give a tenth. And the translation misses the point that there's a doubling of the verb here. I will tithe, yes, tithe. And as my note below from Westermann has, it is obvious the author has taken over a fixed expression from the language of the liturgy. It recalls a similar form of address at the presentation of the offering in Deuteronomy 26. And that's exactly the point. In this wilderness ancient situation, the exilic audience is understanding that Bethel is a sacred place, and if all these things happen, one could tithe to God in that place or in any place, not just to the priest in Jerusalem as Deuteronomy requires. So, having experienced this, he arrives in the land of the people in the east with no further ado, and we'll experience that story next time when he encounters the shepherds looking for the daughter of his uncle Laban. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.